Right now, on February 23rd, the most dangerous diplomatic countdown in the world is ticking. And most people have no idea how close to the edge we actually are. It's not playing out in a war room or on a visible battlefield. It's unfolding on a tiny coral island in the Indian Ocean called Diego Garcia, a place most people couldn't find on a map until last week. Right there on that remote airstrip thousands of miles from anywhere, the U.S. Air Force has positioned 6 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, the most lethal strategic aircraft ever built by any nation on Earth. 6 planes. Each one cost $2 billion to build. Each requires over 1,200 hours of maintenance for every single hour it spends in the air. These are not patrol aircraft. They are not there to run surveillance or monitor shipping lanes. They are purpose-built strategic strike platforms designed for one kind of mission. Each B-2 can carry the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bomb specifically engineered to drill through 200 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. That weapon was designed with exactly one target type in mind: deeply buried, heavily fortified underground nuclear facilities. Precisely what Iran has been quietly rebuilding and reinforcing since last summer. Satellite imagery published just this month shows Iran pouring new concrete over the roof of its Natanz enrichment facility. Analysts say the fortification work has accelerated significantly since the June 2025 strikes. On February 20th, just 3 days ago, President Trump delivered a statement that diplomats normally spend months dancing around before they finally allow themselves to say it in public. He told the world Iran has 10 to 15 days. Make a deal, or bad things will happen. Then on Air Force One, he tightened the timeline even further with reporters listening. I would think that would be enough time. 10, 15 days, pretty much maximum. That isn't diplomatic language. That is a countdown spoken plainly into a microphone at 30,000 feet. And the B-2s sitting on Diego Garcia right now aren't parked there by coincidence. Nothing about American military positioning at this scale, with this equipment, ever happens without a calculated reason behind it. What makes this moment so extraordinary is the sheer speed of escalation. Just weeks ago, the US and Iran were in Geneva talking through Omani intermediaries towards something that briefly looked like progress. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi said publicly that the two sides had reached agreement on broad guiding principles. US negotiator Steve Witkoff described the meetings as productive and constructive. Then, within 72 hours, Trump set a hard military deadline and simultaneously demanded Iran submit a full written proposal within 48 hours, or the diplomatic track would be reconsidered. That pattern will be immediately familiar to anyone who studies American foreign policy. Talk and pressure don't alternate in Washington, they run simultaneously. The pressure track always accelerates faster than diplomacy. That's been true under every administration, and it is especially true under this one. Iran has not been passive in response. Tehran's UN ambassador stood before the Security Council with a formal statement of retaliation. He declared that if the United States attacks, every American base and asset in the region becomes what he called a legitimate target. That's official on the record. And that's not a tweet. That's a formal communication delivered to the United Nations Secretary General, entered into the official record of the Security Council. It carries legal and diplomatic weight. Iran also conducted military exercises near the Strait of Hormuz this week. The strait carries roughly 20% of global oil supply. The timing of those drills alongside a U.S. military deadline is not accidental. Now here's what most coverage is missing. This crisis isn't simply bilateral. The geometry involves 3 other major actors whose individual decisions will significantly shape the outcome: Britain, Israel, and Russia. Britain is in an almost impossible position. Diego Garcia is British territory, and any U.S. strike from that island legally requires London's explicit approval. Prime Minister Starmer has reportedly denied that approval, and the diplomatic fallout between Washington and London is already accelerating. Trump responded not with quiet diplomacy, but with a public truth social post threatening to block Britain's Chagos Islands lease deal, using a strategic military asset as direct leverage against his own closest ally. That is not how allied relationships are supposed to function. In my view, it signals that Washington is now operating under a level of urgency that has begun overriding the established rules of coalition management. Israel is at active defensive readiness. Israeli media reported this week that the IDF moved to a posture nearly identical to what it held in the final days before the June 2025 strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Russia sent a naval vessel to join Iranian military drills in the Gulf of Oman, timed precisely to coincide with Trump's public deadline. Moscow doesn't deliver messages through press releases. It delivers them through ship deployments and coordinated timing. This was both. What you're watching right now isn't just a US-Iran standoff. It's a live stress test of the entire post-June 2025 regional order. The question is whether that order holds or fractures in ways that nobody fully anticipated or planned for when the last bombs fell on Natanz. The next 10 days will answer that question in ways that reshape energy markets, reshape alliances, and fundamentally rewrite the operating logic of nuclear deterrence for the coming decade. There are 4 dimensions almost nobody is discussing together: the military calculus, the nuclear negotiation, the economic pressure on Iran, and the domestic political crisis inside the country. All 4 of those forces are interacting right now in real time. And together, they are shaping how this crisis ends and what comes next. We're going to cover all 4. But first, drop a comment below. Do you think Trump's deadline is real military pressure or calculated leverage designed to force a deal at the table? Hit like so this analysis reaches more people who need to follow this story. It's moving fast, and it only gets more complex from here. Let's keep going. Here's what almost nobody is talking about right now. The talks in Geneva are not failing. They are actually quietly moving faster than anyone expected just 3 weeks ago. On Thursday, February 20th, Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi sat down with CBS News and said something that surprised a lot of analysts who cover this region professionally. He said there is still a good chance for a diplomatic solution. He said the word most analysts didn't expect: win-win. And then he added something that genuinely surprised regional experts. A deal could actually be much better than the 2015 Obama-era nuclear agreement. Now hold on, because that last part is critical. Iran is saying this deal could exceed the terms of the previous nuclear agreement. Not match them, exceed them. That's a significant shift. To understand why, you have to understand what Iran is actually putting on the table right now. And more importantly, what Washington is quietly willing to accept behind closed doors. The public U.S. position is zero enrichment. That's what Secretary of State Rubio says on camera. That's what gets reported. Zero enrichment. Full stop. Non-negotiable. But inside the Geneva talks, the picture is more nuanced. Witkoff and Kushner privately told the Iranian delegation that Trump could consider token enrichment. The condition: Iran must prove that every single path to a nuclear weapon is permanently and verifiably closed. That is not zero enrichment. That's a real negotiating position. What Iran is drafting right now is a proposal built around one central concept: peaceful forever. Araghchi confirmed over the weekend he was still finalizing the text. The proposal is waiting on political sign-off from the supreme leader before it crosses the table in Geneva on Thursday. Iran is offering to commit in writing, with binding IAEA monitoring, that its program will never move toward a weapon. In return, it wants sanctions relief, not symbolic relief. Significant structural relief that would begin reopening Iran's economy to the outside world for the first time in over 2 decades. This is not a small offer. Since Trump withdrew from the original 2015 deal, Iran's economy has been under extraordinary pressure. Inflation has run above 40%. The currency has shed most of its value. Young, educated Iranians are leaving at historically high rates. The regime needs economic relief. Not eventually, but now. That urgency is part of what gives this window its unusual energy. Both sides are under real domestic pressure, pushing toward a deal, even as their public statements keep the threat of conflict alive. On the American side, it's Witkoff and Kushner who are arguing most forcefully inside the administration that diplomacy deserves more time. That might surprise people who assume Trump's team is uniformly hawkish on Iran. But the reporting is clear. Witkoff and Kushner, both in Paris this week for the Syria and Ukraine summits, have told Trump, give the talks one more round. See what Iran actually puts in writing. Then decide. Senator Lindsey Graham is publicly demanding the opposite. He told Axios this weekend that advisors against military action are making a serious mistake. His message to Trump was direct: act decisively and do it now. Don't let diplomacy become a delay tactic for Iran to buy time. Inside Washington right now, there's a genuine split. The president's own envoys say, wait for the proposal, give diplomacy one more round. A powerful senator says, don't wait. And a president who is watching both arguments and, by his own account, still curious why Iran hasn't capitulated. That word, capitulated, deserves a moment of attention because it reveals something important about how this administration is reading the situation. Witkoff actually used it publicly in a Fox News interview. He said Trump is curious why Iran hasn't capitulated, given the amount of sea power and naval power positioned in the region. What Witkoff is describing is a belief that overwhelming force should produce political surrender. Park 2 carrier groups and 6 B-2s within range, and the government folds. It's a theory of coercive pressure that has worked in certain historical cases, but Iran's track record across 4 decades suggests it is not one of them. Iran's response to that logic has been consistent across 4 decades and 8 American presidencies. Pressure hardens domestic opinion. Threats don't produce capitulation. They produce defiance. And the harder the pressure, the more firmly national identity becomes wrapped around the issue being threatened. Iran's nuclear program is not just a strategic asset. Araghchi called it a matter of dignity and pride on CBS This Weekend. Iranian scientists built this technology on their own, through decades of sanctions, targeted killings of colleagues, and U.S.-Israeli strikes on their facilities. Surrendering it entirely doesn't register as a reasonable negotiating concession in Tehran. It registers as a humiliation and as unconditional defeat on a point of national identity. That emotional reality doesn't show up in enrichment percentages or missile counts, but it shapes every decision made in Tehran. And understanding it is essential to understanding why this negotiation is so difficult, and also, quietly, carefully, why it might still succeed. Because what both sides are really searching for is a face-saving frame that lets each government call the outcome a victory. Because here's the thing, Iran is not saying no, it is saying not zero, but close, monitored, verified, peaceful forever, with international guarantees. That's the offer forming. Whether Washington can accept token enrichment with full monitoring as a genuine win, and whether Trump can sell that framing to the American public and to Israel, is the central question. That single question will determine whether the next 10 days end at a negotiating table or with bombs in the air over Iranian soil. And on Thursday in Geneva, when Iran's written proposal finally crosses the table, we will get the clearest signal yet about which direction this actually goes. On February 17th, while diplomats were sitting in a room in Geneva negotiating a nuclear deal, Iran did something it has not done since the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. It formally announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, for the first time since the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, when Iran mined the waterway during open naval combat. Not permanently, not completely, but formally, officially. With a military announcement, Iran declared sections of the world's most critical oil choke point temporarily closed for live-fire naval exercises. And at that exact moment, in that same Geneva building, the US and Iranian delegations were still talking, negotiating, searching for common ground. Let that sink in. Iran was closing its most powerful economic weapon at the same time its diplomats were shaking hands with American envoys down the corridor. That is not a coincidence. That is a message, delivered in two languages simultaneously, one diplomatic, one military, to make sure Washington understood both. Here's why this waterway matters more than almost any geography on the planet right now. It is a curved channel just 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, 21 miles. You could drive that distance in under 30 minutes, and yet it is the single most critical oil choke point in the world. Through that gap flows roughly 20% of all oil traded globally every single day. The U.S. Energy Information Administration puts the figure at about 20 million barrels of crude per day in 2024. That is not a regional number, that is a global number. And it all passes through a gap that Iran's military borders on one side. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, the UAE, every major Gulf oil exporter depends on that narrow passage to reach the world. And so does nearly every country that imports their energy. Almost half of India's crude oil imports move through Hormuz, 60% of its natural gas supplies. Japan, South Korea, China, each of them deeply dependent on uninterrupted flow through that 21-mile gap. China imports roughly 11 million barrels of oil per day, and a very large share of that volume flows directly through Hormuz on its way to Chinese ports and refineries. Any disruption, even a short one, hits Beijing's manufacturing economy almost immediately, with consequences that spread across global supply chains within days. Now here's what makes the Iranian drill so significant beyond the symbolism. The IRGC Navy commander, Rear Admiral Tangsiri, didn't just conduct the exercises and stay quiet. He made a public statement. He said Iran stands ready to shut down the strait. Those were his exact words, published by Tasnim News Agency, an outlet directly affiliated with the IRGC. Ready to shut down. And the name Iran gave to the exercise tells you everything about the intent. Smart control of the Strait of Hormuz. Not defense, not patrol. Control, smart control. Iran was announcing to every shipping company, every oil market trader, every government that imports Gulf energy, that it considers the Strait of Hormuz within its operational command. The legal dimension here is genuinely important and almost never discussed. Under international maritime law, states exercise sovereignty within 12 nautical miles of their coastline. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz and its designated shipping lanes fall almost entirely within the territorial waters of Iran and Oman. That means Iran has real legally grounded geographic leverage over this waterway. It is not a bluff that can be dismissed with a wave of the hand. The U.S. Navy patrols the region with 2 carrier strike groups positioned nearby. But even U.S. military planners acknowledge they cannot prevent Iran from mining sections of the strait, and they cannot neutralize Iran's coastal missile batteries before some of them fire. The geography of Hormuz does not allow for a clean, risk-free military response. Iran holds the high ground along the northern shore. The IRGC has spent decades and billions of dollars building precisely the kind of asymmetric naval capability designed to threaten large, expensive American warships in confined, shallow waters. The IRGC arsenal includes supersonic anti-ship missiles, swarms of fast attack boats built to overwhelm carrier defenses, and drone systems tested specifically in signal jamming conditions. All of that was on display in the February drill. This wasn't a routine exercise. It was a demonstration of capability, timed for maximum diplomatic visibility. So when Khamenei stood before cameras on February 17th and said, "A warship is a dangerous apparatus, but more dangerous is the weapon that can sink the warship into the depths of the sea," he wasn't speaking abstractly. He was describing a genuine operational capability, one that U.S. military planners have taken seriously in their own assessments of a potential Persian Gulf conflict for over a decade. Now let's talk about what an actual closure of the Strait of Hormuz would mean for the global economy, because this is the part that hits everyone, not just the countries directly involved. Analysts at Lombard Odier estimate that even a partial temporary disruption of Hormuz traffic would drive a commodity price shock that would be felt across global supply chains within days. Energy research firm MST Marquee has estimated that a full closure could raise oil prices by $10 to $20 per barrel. That might not sound dramatic in isolation, but the ripple effects compound quickly. Higher oil means higher manufacturing costs, higher shipping, higher food prices. Modern agriculture runs on fuel, airlines, trucking, petrochemicals. Every sector that touches energy gets hit at the same time. And those costs don't stay regional. They travel through supply chains until they land on grocery shelves and fuel pumps in countries that have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz. For countries already under inflation pressure, which in 2026 includes most of the developed world, an oil shock from Hormuz would arrive at the worst possible moment. Here's the strategic irony that Lombard Odier flagged directly. Closing Hormuz is a high-cost option for Iran itself. The regime's primary income is oil exports. Blocking the strait shuts down Iran's own revenue at the exact moment it most needs cash to sustain itself under military pressure. It's a weapon that cuts its own hand, so Iran is wielding a weapon that also cuts its own hand, which is precisely why most serious analysts assess a full, extended closure as unlikely, even if Iran is provoked by a U.S. strike. What's more probable, according to Koppler and independent energy research firms, is targeted harassment, slowing tanker traffic, issuing warnings, forcing rerouting. Enough to spike a fear premium into oil prices without triggering a full confrontation. Strategic disruption without full escalation. That's the scenario most analysts consider realistic. That fear premium is already partially priced in. Brent crude has traded with elevated volatility throughout the month of February, and it hasn't finished moving yet. Shipping insurers have raised war risk premiums for the Gulf region to levels not seen since the tanker attacks of 2019. The market is hedging, even if it hasn't fully repriced the risk yet. But here's the most important thing to understand about February 17th. Iran didn't just send a military signal. It sent an economic signal to every country in the world that depends on that waterway. The audience wasn't Washington alone. It was Beijing, Tokyo, New Delhi, and Seoul. Every major economy whose industrial output depends on Gulf energy flowing without interruption. The implicit message to Beijing, to Tokyo, to New Delhi, to Seoul was this: if Washington strikes Iran, your energy supply chain is in the crossfire too. This isn't just America's problem, it's yours. That's central to understanding why China and Russia have called loudly for restraint this month. They aren't acting from concern for Iranian sovereignty. They're acting from direct economic self-interest. And the Strait of Hormuz is the most concrete expression of that interest in the entire crisis. And in my view, that economic dimension, the energy vulnerability that runs straight from the Strait of Hormuz into the industrial heartlands of Asia, is the most under-discussed factor in this entire crisis. Because ultimately, what happens in that 21-mile gap will shape the outcome of the Geneva negotiations, just as much as anything said in a conference room. Here is the single detail that changes everything about how you read the events of the next 10 days, and most people haven't focused on it. On February 19th, top national security officials told President Trump the military is ready for potential strikes on Iran as soon as this Saturday, according to CBS News, citing sources familiar with the briefing. Not after another diplomatic round, not in 3 weeks. As soon as this coming Saturday, according to people with direct knowledge of the briefing. Trump has not made a final decision. The conversations are described as fluid and ongoing, actively weighing both paths. But the infrastructure for a strike is no longer being assembled. It is already fully in place. And that is a fundamentally different situation from where things stood even 2 weeks ago, when the buildup was still underway. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Group is already in the Arabian Sea. The USS Gerald R. Ford, a second nuclear carrier, is en route, currently moving through the eastern Mediterranean. U.S. officials told Axios that the Ford's arrival will be a key factor in timing any military action. The clock is tied directly to the carrier's position. When both carriers are in position, expected within days, Trump will have assembled the largest American military force in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. That is not a figure of speech or journalistic hyperbole. That is a direct assessment from officials inside the U.S. government. That comparison matters deeply. The 2003 buildup ended in war. Every analyst watching that accumulation of force understood what it meant before the first bomb fell. You don't park that much firepower in one theater at that level of operational readiness and then quietly sail it home without a result. But here's where this situation diverges from 2003 in an important way, and why the outcome is genuinely less certain than the media coverage often suggests. But here's where this diverges from 2003 in a meaningful way. Trump does not want a war with no exit. That's been consistent across both of his terms. He pulled back from striking Iran in 2019. He ended the June 2025 campaign faster than his own advisors expected. This week, he told CNN he is wary of any operation lacking a decisive outcome and risking American lives. That is the framing of a president still treating the threat of war as the most powerful leverage he has, not a president who has already decided to pull the trigger. CNN reported Trump has argued both sides of the military question in the same conversations this week. He has been polling advisors and allies, including Netanyahu, who visited the White House February 11th. Netanyahu's message was specific. After the June 2025 strikes, the mass protests, and the economic collapse, Iran has never been weaker. If there is a moment to extract maximum concessions, it is right now. Trump has absorbed that argument. His own advisors have pushed back hard. A massive campaign could run for weeks, cost billions, and produce consequences no model can fully anticipate. The tension between Netanyahu's strategic window and his advisors' risk warnings is precisely where Trump is sitting right now, making what may be the most consequential decision of his second term. The Atlantic Council published a detailed analysis on February 21st with one central warning. If Iran responds even symbolically and Trump escalates, both sides enter an escalation ladder. Regional conflicts rarely begin with a deliberate plan for full war. They begin with a reactive sequence, each response making the next step harder to walk back or avoid. At that point, both governments face what their planners describe as existential stakes. For Tehran, survival of the regime itself. For Washington, the credibility of the world's remaining superpower. And in a conflict framed as existential by both sides, neither government gets to simply call a timeout mid-sequence and reassess the situation from a place of calm. Now, let's talk about the scenario most people aren't considering, the one where a deal actually happens. Because according to reporting from multiple outlets this week, it is still a real possibility. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi is expected to deliver a formal written proposal at Thursday's Geneva session, built around the Peaceful Forever framework. It is expected to include binding IAEA monitoring, specific enrichment limits, and a request for phased, substantial sanctions relief, enough to meaningfully reopen Iran's economy to international trade. The critical unknown is whether that proposal gives Trump enough, politically, symbolically, and substantively, to stand in front of cameras and declare a genuine victory on Iran's nuclear program. In my view, this is as much a domestic political calculation as it is a foreign policy one. Trump needs a narrative for his base. We stopped Iran's nuclear program. We didn't start a war. We got it done in 15 days. That story, if he can tell it honestly, is one his supporters would celebrate. The question is whether Iran gives him enough to build it. The problem is that Iran is unlikely to offer complete dismantlement of enrichment. Trump has publicly said that's what he wants. There's a real gap between what Iran can concede without political collapse at home and what Trump can accept without looking, to his own supporters and to Israel, like he blinked. That gap is precisely where the next 10 days will be decided. Everything else is context. That gap is the actual story. Here is the most honest way to frame the 4 realistic paths forward, based on everything reported and analyzed as of February 23rd, because the range of outcomes here is genuinely wide. Path 1 is a deal. Thursday's proposal gives Witkoff and Kushner enough to bring Trump a genuine framework worth accepting. Deep limits, full monitoring, not dismantlement, but close enough. War is avoided, markets stabilize. Trump claims credit for halting Iran's program without a single additional U.S. strike. Path 2 is a limited strike. Trump decides Thursday's offer isn't enough, orders a targeted campaign against nuclear and missile sites, larger than June 2025 but contained. Iran retaliates symbolically. Both sides step back. Negotiations resume, with Washington holding significantly more leverage than it holds today. Path 3 is full escalation. A U.S. strike triggers an Iranian response that kills American service members. Trump escalates. The conflict expands across the region. Proxies, Hormuz, Israeli territory drawn in. Nobody planned for this path, but Critically, nobody has a clear plan to avoid it once the first serious casualties occur on either side. Path 4 is extended delay. Thursday's offer needs more time. The deadline shifts again. Carriers hold position at enormous daily cost. Iran talks while continuing to enrich. The cycle extends, as it has with remarkable durability, across more than 2 decades of American administrations. Every analyst watching this closely considers Path 4 the least likely. Keeping 2 carrier groups and hundreds of aircraft on full combat alert indefinitely is economically unsustainable past mid-March. Virtually no serious observer believes Trump will maintain that posture without either a deal or a strike before spring. What I find most striking, and what the daily news cycle consistently misses, is that the outcome of these 10 days will not just affect Iran and the United States. It will define whether American coercive diplomacy, the model of building overwhelming force to extract last-minute concessions, still functions in a world that has spent 20 years preparing to resist it. How that question gets answered in the next 10 days carries consequences far beyond any single negotiation or any single country. If a deal emerges, this model of diplomacy is validated. If conflict follows without a decisive outcome, U.S. credibility takes a hit that resonates through every active flashpoint. Taiwan, Ukraine, the South China Sea. Those aren't abstract geopolitical observations. They are the exact strategic calculations being run in Beijing and Moscow right now, as this situation develops hour by hour. That is not a story about Iran's nuclear program. It is a story about the architecture of global order, and who gets to enforce the rules that hold it together. Right now, in February 2026, it is unfolding. 10 days at a time, carrier by carrier, in rooms in Geneva where the most consequential conversations of this decade are happening far from any camera. If you followed this all the way through, thank you. Share this with someone who needs the full picture, not just the headlines. Subscribe if you want to follow what happens when Thursday's Geneva session breaks and the next phase of this clarifies. The window is closing, and we will know soon enough which direction it goes.